In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Welcome to the next installment of our series, Everyday Monk. This talk we're going to call A Taste of Reality. A Taste of Reality. And we'll get to what that means later. But it'll be focused on the idea of solitude. Before we start, I'd like to recap, just so we're all on the same page. So, Everyday Monk. We come from a tradition as the Orthodox Church that is very heavy in a monastic spirituality. But we, the actual Orthodox Christians on the ground, have little, I think, connection with our monastic roots. We rarely, especially here in the States, are going to monasteries for trips, or rarely sort of in the monastic life, just because our life here is a bit different, and we don't have as many monasteries accessible to us. Another thing is that a lot of the monastic writings, the Egyptian monastic writings, haven't been translated until recently. So it's sort of a spirituality that we need to rediscover for ourselves. And so this whole series came about as an idea to take what is already ours and to get to know it again. How to take the time-tested treasures of the desert, where the monks went out, monks meaning the men and women who went out, and how to apply those things into our everyday lives. Okay? So that's sort of where the series came from, where we wanted to take all of the important things, the practices that they do, and use them as practices in our own lives. Last week, His Grace Bishop Caruz spoke to us about fasting, and it was a really wonderful talk because usually when we think of fasting, we think of food. Yeah, fasting and food, change of diet. And what His Grace did was that he expanded the topic of fasting to much bigger than food. He talked to us about the fasting from people, the fasting from words, the fasting from busyness, fasting from fill in the blank, along with the change of the diet that the church gives us. And how through this fasting we're able to make room for being filled by God rather than being filled by the world. Right? And if you'll notice, I think at least, that a lot of the topics that we'll be speaking about over the course of the next few weeks are interwoven into each other. So you notice that last week he spoke about fasting from people. What is that? Solitude. He also spoke about fasting from words. What is that? Silence, right? So all of these topics, you'll find that they're interwoven with each other. So solitude today, you can't have solitude without stillness, or without silence. You can't have solitude, or what's the point of solitude if there's no prayer? What is your solitude being fed by if you're not fasting, right? All of these things sort of go together. So you'll hear a lot of the same themes over and over the course of this series. To give an overview of what we'll talk about today, I want to talk about what is solitude, I want to talk about why solitude, and I want to talk about how solitude. In terms of the what exactly is the purpose behind solitude? Why are we called to solitude? Are we called to solitude? And if so, what is the purpose behind this solitude? And what is it exactly? What does it mean to be in solitude? And what does it not mean to be in solitude? Because I think solitude especially has a lot of misconceptions. The why, what are the fruits of solitude? So after I've figured out the what, right, of what is solitude, what can I actually gain from taking on solitude in my everyday life? What are the things that I can expect to carry now that I've experienced and tasted solitude in my everyday life? And lastly, practically incorporating solitude without running for the hills, right? Because the idea here is an everyday monk. This isn't a series on monasticism where we're presenting to you what the monastic life looks like in hopes that some of you will go to the monastery and live the monastic life. Rather, it's flipped, where the hope is that we're learning from monastic practices in order to incorporate into our everyday life. So in terms of solitude, in this crazy world that we live in, how do we incorporate solitude without having to run to the hills behind our homes, right? So, I want to begin at the beginning. Abuna David talked about this in the first week of this series, and I'd like to reiterate it because I think, although we talked about fasting last week, because that's what His Grace spoke to us about, I think solitude is sort of the starting point for this whole thing. Why? A man called Anthony, or Antonios, in Egypt, was attending his liturgy and the gospel reading for that day was these verses here, and he took it personally, and he took it literally, and from that we get the beginnings of monasticism. So he was in liturgy, and he heard, and Jesus said to him, "If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Come and follow me." Right? So we know that St. Anthony heard this while attending church in a mindset where he was looking for how to save himself, right? We usually start his story at this verse, but before this story, what was happening? St. Anthony was looking for a way to save himself, okay? To find salvation, to find Christ. And he got his answer to his prayers when he heard this verse. And so he took it, he went and sold everything that he had, and he went for a short time and was a laborer just on the edge of the city, and eventually he went out into the desert and began a period of solitude, I think of 20 years, where he lived by himself. That's good. Solitude, in this case, came. Where did it come from? Why did he have this idea to go and flee into the desert? It came as a response. Why? The church, up until this moment, was an underground church, right? The church, up until this moment, from the time of the apostles until right around the time of St. Anthony, was illegal. It was hidden. It was secret, right? It was persecuted, heavily persecuted. People were being martyred left and right. Like Abuna mentioned, with the Edict of Milan, which is a statement given by Emperor Constantine, right, in the year 313, Emperor Constantine made Christianity legal for the first time, which meant what? It meant that the church, for the first time, was going to be part of the everyday world. Again, it meant for the first time in the church's life that the church was going to be part of the everyday world, and that the illegalness and the hiding and the persecution, all of that was basically behind them. And what happened was that Anthony, along with other people, realized what joining the world looked like. Okay? They realized what joining the world looked like. And they basically describe it as, they saw the world as a sinking ship, right? This isn't really a historical accurate picture, it's from Britain, but just to use the analogy. They saw the world as a sinking ship, and they're fleeing to the desert, right? Not to be weird or not to be those strange guys who don't like people or they just reject and don't love and whatever. No, rather, they saw the world as a place where things were sinking, and their separation from the world was the only way that they could save themselves. Again, they saw that if they, individually, Anthony didn't say, let's all leave and do a mass exodus into the desert, this place is corrupt and we shouldn't be here. No. Anthony for himself said, I can't find my salvation if I remain in this world. So what do I need? I leave. So solitude in this case came as a response to the world. What's so wrong with the world? What's so wrong with the world that they would have to leave? Actually, if you were here for the liturgy, Abuna gave a great intro that I was also planning on giving about the prodigal son. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's really nice, actually, that one, we're both sort of speaking about the same thing, and two, that the topic of solitude is coming on the prodigal son Sunday. I think it's to our advantage, actually. The prodigal son, like Abuna mentioned and like the gospel said this morning, he left his father's house and he went and he lived among the pigs, right? And he spent everything he had, he ran out of money, and then he started living among the pigs. A Christian writer wrote on this, Father Thomas Hopko, and he said something really interesting. He said, imagine for a second that he hadn't come to himself. Imagine for a second that the prodigal son hadn't come to himself and realized like the pig pen that he was living in, right? And he just went about living in the pig pen, and eventually he found friends in the pig pen, right? The real world is outside. He was living in the pig pen. Imagine he hadn't come to himself, And he starts living in the pig pen. And eventually he has friends in the pig pen. And eventually he has a pig pen marriage. And eventually he has pig pen children, right? And eventually they start building pig pen movie theaters and pig pen whatever, right? There's pig pen theater and pig pen media and pig pen values. Pig pen Starbucks, sure. Or Panera, thank you. And this is the world that now they know to be true. Imagine that he had never left the pig pen. They start to realize, or they start to basically not realize that there's anything outside of the pig pen. They've gotten so used to muddy food, muddy relationships, muddy tempers, muddy raising of children, muddy fill in the blank, that this is now their new normal, right? And then someone, many generations later and later and later and later, after his family now has lived there for decades, comes and tells them, you can leave the pig pen and there's something much better outside of the pig pen. This is exactly what Christ did, right? The world was fallen, and we created for ourselves a world of hurt and of pain and of anger and of greed and of envy and fill in the blanks, right? And this has become our normal. This has become our normal, and we don't realize that this is the weirdness, and outside of this is real life, right? So Anthony and those who fled to the deserts saw this exact thing, that the world and the prince of this world, the pig himself, that this world isn't real. It's not reality, right? What this world tells us is that you are loved by the amount of people, like in our day, you are loved by the amount of people who view your Snapchat story and how many followers you have on Instagram, and am I getting my promotions on time at work, and whatever, right? This is the world that we've built for ourselves. This is the pig pen of the world that we've built for ourselves, right? And like Abuna mentioned, actually, he started getting his identity now from this, right? He started getting his identity from this. And what the monastics saw, and they were wise enough to see, was that they saw the mud of the world. And they wanted to flee this pig pen world and seek the real world, right? It's not a different world, it's the real world, right? Because no one would logically go after the generations and generations of the prodigal son's family lived in the pig pen and say, oh, this is a world and this is a... No, this is still a pig pen, right? Just because it's normal, just because there's mud everywhere in this world, doesn't make it okay or now just accepted, right? Let's click. So the world presents us with false truths, and it does it with preoccupation and with urgency. And like we said, it's fueled by greed and pride and the need to be satisfied. Why preoccupation and urgency? What does our day look like? Yeah. 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 And I'm speaking for myself before anyone else. The first thing I do in the morning, on days where I'm not aware and living in the pig pen world, is I look at my phone. Literally, I don't even have two eyes open. I have one eye open, and I look at my phone. You can ask Sandy, that's exactly how it happens. I look at my phone, and I'm attached to my phone. And then I go about my day, and I'm scattered, and I'm all over the place. And I have a zillion meetings and things and whatevers. And I try to squeeze in time for this and that. And when I try to relax, all I'm doing is trying to turn off my brain by watching a bunch of videos or something. This is the reality that we've created for ourselves. This is the new normal, right? This is the mud pig pen world that we've created for ourselves, right? And I think this resonated with a lot of us when we talked in our last series, Becoming a Healing Presence, when we spoke about stillness, right? Because this is very much the same material. And so from this confusion of a world comes what? A very confused sense of who I am, a very confused sense of who I am, what's my identity exactly. And we see that the prodigal son was going through the exact same thing. Who am I? I know that I'm the son of this man, but I've given that up, so I have to figure it out, and I have to figure out who I am now, right? Without realizing that, the simple solution is to just go back to your original identity of being the son of the Father. Yeah? I shared this quote last time when we spoke about stillness, and I think it resonated with a lot of people, so I wanted to share it again. Because I think we think of solitude or stillness or silence as this way to like turn off our brain, right? So we see life as busy, and we see the practice of solitude or silence as rest. But it's not that. Solitude isn't the turning off of the brain, right? It's actually turning on the brain to see with real eyes the mud of the world and to see the mud of the self. This verse says, from Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, it says, solitude is a way, a state of the soul, in which all of the powers of the soul and of the faculties of the body are completely at peace, quiet, and recollected, perfectly alert. Right? Not this like yoga world that we've created now. I want to be zen and I want to relax and I want to do yoga, which will remove me from the world. It's the exact opposite. I will become perfectly alert in my solitude. I'll have eyes that will be able to see the mud. I'll have eyes that will be able to allow me to come to myself, right? Isn't that what happened with the prodigal son? He came to himself. Just like Abuna was saying, why did that happen? Solitude is the place where that happens. Perfectly alert, yet free from any turmoil or agitation, free of any mud, basically. And to talk more about solitude, about what it is, I think sometimes we hear solitude and we think of aloneness. Again, we think solitude and we think of loneliness or being by yourself. You can be in solitude in the crowdest room. Again, you can be in solitude in the crowdest room. You also should be in solitude in a not crowded room, right? That has its own time. But the idea of solitude is not just being alone. The idea of solitude is being alone in the presence of God. Those are two different things, right? Being alone and being alone in the presence of God are two very different things. So solitude isn't, okay, once a week from now on, I'm going to go on a walk and I'll come back in an hour and I've done solitude. That could be a way to do solitude, right? But going into it, you have to know that the purpose of solitude, which is what we're about to get to, is solitude is where we go to realign ourselves and immerse ourselves in truth. Again, solitude is almost like a room that we're entering in our mind and in our heart, where we go to realign ourselves and immerse ourselves in truth. What does this simply mean from today's gospel? Solitude is the place where we go to come to ourselves. Solitude is the place that we go to come to ourselves, where we are free from the world, from the confusion of the world, from the mud of the world. We're even solitary to ourselves, right? Because we're the centers of our own universe. So in solitude, we push ourselves off to the side and remember truth. And what do I mean by truth? We remember the truth of what our actual identity is, right? The guy came to himself and he said what? He didn't fully get it, but he sort of got it. He said, at least my father would take care of me as a servant. If he had fully come to himself, he would have said, what the heck am I doing? I am the son of this man, and he will love me regardless. I have done horrible things, yes, but he will love me. Let me return and ask for his forgiveness, right? That's what would have happened if he fully came to himself. But thank God he came to himself a bit, and then he got there, and we know the rest of the story. To add to that, the purpose behind solitude, solitude is where we allow ourselves to live in response to the truth about God, ourselves, and others. So solitude is the place where we wipe the mud off of our eyes and see God for who he truly is, see ourselves for who we truly are, and see our neighbor for who they truly are. Right? Why can't this be done without solitude? Solitude is the place where you take away the barriers that keep us from doing this regularly. Solitude is the place where the blinders come off and we're allowed to exercise these muscles that we don't exercise enough, of realigning ourselves to truth. We live in a society where truth doesn't mean anything. I'm sorry if that's a bold statement, but truth is relative in our society. You can have your truth, and you can have your truth, and as long as you guys agree to disagree, it's fine. Is that really truth? Truth shouldn't be dependent on the person. Truth is truth, right? You can't say your truth is true and your truth is true, because that's just not how truth works, right? Being in solitude is being away from even yourself and your own misconceptions about things, and having intentional time to realign yourself, to come to yourself and seek real truth. Does that make sense? Bless you. Any questions? I know this is a lot of theory, and we'll get to more of the how to actually work this out. We'll get to the practice, but any questions so far? No bad questions. We don't talk about this often, so. Okay. So we know the purpose behind solitude. The solitude, you can almost say, is like the furnace where gold becomes gold. It's the fire that burns out all of the bad and allows you to see clearly. And we live in a society that is anti-solitude. How many ways are you connected? I pray that I can throw my cell phone out one day, because people can reach me through text, through email, through phone call, through Facebook Messenger, through Twitter Messenger, through Instagram Messenger, through Snapchat, through Snapchat Messenger. All of these ways I can be reached, right? So to make sure, our society makes sure that there is not a moment that goes by where something isn't buzzing. Not a moment that goes by that would give you the chance to realize the mud of the world. That would give you the chance to realize that you need to come to yourself, right? The world has painted this picture so well of this mud town, right? And everything just seems normal. Who's seen The Twilight Zone? Yeah? The Twilight Zone is the show where like everything is normal, right? In every episode except for one tiny thing, right? But the show sort of like plays it to not notice the one tiny thing that's off until the very end, right? And this is sort of the world that we live in. We live in a Twilight Zone where this is the pig pen, right? And we know that. Christ calls, who's the prince of this world? He didn't say he was the prince of this world. He called Satan the prince of this world, right? So this is his domain. And so we live in a world that like is almost perfect. It seems like it just makes it, when in reality, if you get that little thing that's missing in the Twilight Zone episode, you realize how weird everything else is, right? And solitude is the place to do that. Yeah? Okay. The fruits of solitude. 3 fruits that I'd like to speak about. 1, being about our relationship with God. 2, being about our relationship and our understanding of ourselves. And 3, our relationship and our understanding of our neighbor. 1, being in the presence of God. Solitude is the place, like Ambakar spoke last week, where we come and leave ourselves at the door, our world at the door, our distractions at the door, our preoccupation, our urgency at the door, and come and sit in the presence of God. What does that mean? What does that actually mean? Do you ever just stop for a second during your day and think, like, this isn't even part of my notes anymore, I'm speaking off script. And think to yourself, like, man, this thing called Christianity is nuts. Like I'm changing my diet randomly, like during the year, and I'm going to this thing where this guy with a beard is dressing up and he's in a dress, and we're eating this bread and we're calling it like, to the outside, this is what looks nuts. This is what looks nuts, right? And the world has deceived us so well, and the world has deceived itself so well, to think that this is the nuts part. Yeah? And even, like, do we stop to think, like, how did this all come to be? And, like, those big questions of, like, who created all this, right? And when we realize that God really does exist, right, we have to ask ourselves, is our life living in response to the existence of God? Or is God this one thing over here and my life this one thing over here, and they overlap every once in a while? right? C.S. Lewis, a Christian writer of the 19th century, he says, if the resurrection of Christ, I'm paraphrasing, the resurrection of Christ is either the least important thing or the most important thing. What it cannot be is moderately important, right? It can't. Because if Christ rose from the dead, that changes everything. And if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then all that we're doing is make-believe and theater and obligation, and we can't go to brunch on Sundays, and that's what we're doing, right? But if he did rise from the dead, that changes A through Z, right? Alpha through Omega. And solitude, in terms of God, is the place where we just sit and think about these types of things. We think and say, if God really is who he says he is, or even ask the question, who does God say he is? Maybe God, in the way that he presents himself, is different than the God that I have in my own mind, right? Solitude is the place where I do my best to see God for who he really is, and ask myself if I'm living a life in response to that existence. Does that make sense? We ask ourselves all the time, why aren't I getting closer to God? Why aren't I getting closer to God? I'd love to get closer to God, right? And almost imagine an overflowing cup of water, right? Can you fit anything in this water, or in this cup? No. Does this cup have the right to say, man, I wonder why I'm not being filled with iced tea? No, because the water's up to the brim, right? How would you fit the iced tea in there, right? Solitude is the place where we start emptying our cup, where we start moving stuff out of our cup and making room for iced tea instead of water, right? Solitude is the place where we can be real about how much we're allowing God to dwell in our own lives. Yeah? And solitude is the place where we can ask ourselves, if God is for real, then how can I have my cup filled with everything else? How can I? Right? It's either the most important or it's not important. It can't be in the middle. Right? And that goes on to number 2, which is the second fruit, which is meeting yourself. Right? You can think of solitude as looking in the mirror. Solitude is the place where you look in the mirror. Solitude is the place where you sit with yourself and you examine yourself, and 2 things happen there. One, remember, solitude is the place where we go back to reality. So the first thing that would happen here is, what is my real identity? Not this identity that the world has created for me, this false self. What is my real identity? And second, what am I doing that isn't compatible with my real identity? Right? Solitude is the place where we can sit down. It's the doctor's office. It's the place where we sit down and we tweeze out the anger, the, man, I can't believe she said that to me. Or the, I'm in a horrible mood and I have no idea why. Or you can fill in the blank. Right? This is the place where those types of questions are asked. Solitude is the place, is the room, is the mindset, is the practice where these things happen. Does that make sense? Because no one would leave in the morning and not look in the mirror to check their hair and check their teeth and check their whatevers, right? But we go days, weeks, months, years without sitting with ourselves and asking ourselves why we are the way we are. We do things, we say things, we go to things, and we don't have time to ask ourselves why we do and why we say and why we go, right? We don't give ourselves the room to ask ourselves why we're this way. Solitude is that place. Solitude is the room, making room in our lives to sit with ourselves and look at ourselves in the mirror. And to one, before all else, remember our real identity and come to ourselves. And 2, figure out why we're not there. And to constantly work on ourselves, right? And this is not a one-time thing. Just like when I spoke about stillness a few weeks ago, stillness isn't, okay, I'm going to take a stillness day and I'm going to do this and I'll be set. No, this is a all the time type of thing. And we'll get to that when we get to how do we actually incorporate stillness. The third thing, which is what our last series was on, is becoming a healing presence. or being there for our neighbor, right? Being a healing presence to them. I'd like to read from the miracle of Christ feeding the 5,000, right? Because whether we realize it or not, Christ in the Gospels goes into periods of solitude all the time. All the time. And I think we just read over them like quickly, oh, and he went off. And we don't really like put any context to that, or we don't think about it, right? But all the time, especially in this story, it says it twice in the same chapter, Christ goes off and he makes a point to be by himself in solitude, right? So if Christ, the Son of God, the incarnate Word of God, is going off and being in solitude, how much more is it of need to me, right? Let's read. So the story starts with, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. I'm going to be honest right now. I'm in ministry, obviously, but I'm not a people person. And there are Sundays where I know that there are 30 people that I need to talk to, or there are days when I know that there's 20 people that I need to go and visit, right? But I'm not up for the challenge. And seeing Christ react this way always blows my mind. Because he didn't freak out and say, oh, so many people, so many conversations, they need so much from me. What did he do instead? He had compassion on them, right? Like, how often do we have compassion on other people? We barely can get through our own day, like, and our own needs on our own. How often does someone who needs something from us come to us and we gladly help them? At least for myself, I'm always fine, okay, right? And I'm learning this in marriage, very up close and personal. But Christ had compassion on them, right? When he saw the multitude, a multitude, not like a group of people or like this family, or a multitude. And we know how many is this multitude, because we read later in the story and I don't think we connect it. This multitude is 5,000 men plus women and children. This isn't like 30, 40, 50, 100 people. This is 5,000 men plus women and children. That's potentially 15,000 people, right? That's Christ had compassion on. Why? Christ knew that he would be needed. And where did he gain his strength? How did he become a healing presence? How was he always a healing presence? Solitude was the place that he did that. Solitude was the place that he did that. Some of us may say, no, I'm patient and I'm helpful and I'm serving and I wouldn't roll my eyes, or I would love to help anyone who needs help. Great. Do it. And then at the end of it, you're exhausted and you can't stand anything and you're ready to leave, and great. Let's keep reading. So they all ate and were filled. We know the middle of the story, so I skipped a few verses. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitude away, he went up to a mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. So how did Christ start and end his ministry? Solitude. So for us in our solitude, when we talk about becoming a healing presence, when we talk about being a good friend to someone, we talk about being a good husband or a good wife, where is our solitude? Where is our compassion going to come for this one person, not the multitude, for this one person in our way, if there's no solitude, right? How? It doesn't work, right? Solitude is the place where we can come to ourselves and remember that solitude is the place where we realign ourselves to truth. Realign ourselves to truth. Wipe off the mud from our eyes and realize that we're different. That the world is called to be different, and everyone in it. And that we are meant to be instruments of realigning people also. Right? Because ultimately, if we've figured out, we might be few, we might be the minority, but if we've figured out that this is a mud world, I hope, we can't help but tell other people that this is a mud world, rather than the opposite. Right? That them tell us that this is nice, and this is perfect, and this is flowery, and this is where you're meant to be, and No, we're travelers here. We're on a pit stop, right? Are we living our life in light of that? Solitude is the place where we align ourselves daily, weekly, monthly, yearly to that idea, to that truth. Any questions? Okay. Some practical stuff. We'll talk about entering solitude daily. We'll talk about entering solitude weekly. And we'll talk about entering solitude yearly. Okay? Just to be practical and to cover all our bases. Entering solitude daily. Is there a day that goes by where you don't where you have to remind yourself to eat? No. It's built in, right? Why? Because you know what you gain from food and you have a hunger inside of you for food, right? It's built in. Daily, we can work in solitude in a bunch of different ways, right? I know, and I'm trying to be practical, and it's hard to say that every day in the morning I'm going to spend an hour by myself off in the something by myself. I know that's not the life that we live. It's tough, right? But what we said in the beginning was that solitude doesn't necessarily mean that you are alone, right? Our solitude daily can come from times that are just idle. I'm going to get my oil changed and I have an hour and a half in the waiting room. Chance for solitude. Instead of refreshing your Facebook feed 50 times, right? To see if anyone posts something exciting and new, right? If I may say, sorry, this might be a little PG-13, but who goes to the bathroom anymore without their cell phone? I don't think it exists. I think people have a hard time going to the bathroom without their phones or their laptops or their movie theaters or whatever you want to fill in the blank with. Those moments, even those moments, can be times of solitude. As weird as it might sound. I think it's weirder to say that we can't go to the bathroom for a few minutes without taking our phones. I think that's the weirdness, right? Another time for solitude during our day. The moment we wake up and right as we go to bed. Why? Why are these so crucial? Because you're starting your day, before you allow any mud to penetrate your eyes, you're starting your day and saying, you're taking just a minute, get out of bed before you touch your phone and take a minute of, this is my identity, this is who God is, this is my purpose for the day. Solitude, and it takes a minute, right? It's more of a thing up here than it is about time, right? In our prayer, right, if we have quiet time or prayer time or scripture reading every day, why not just take a minute or two of not saying anything? Yes, prayer is good, but sometimes we talk God's ear off. Just be, right? And again, of course, this goes along with silence, which we'll talk about next week. And after prayer, sitting and saying, what did I gain from this experience? And being real about it, right? Again, solitude is the way to enter into reality. So we do our prayers as habits and as obligations, but solitude is the place where we ask ourselves why and what did I gain, right? Oh, I was supposed to click. Sorry, guys. Solitude weekly. I think this is where it's fair to say we need to have structured, scheduled time for solitude at least once a week, right? It might be hard to schedule something every day, but I think it's you can't go without a week of just sitting with yourself and realigning yourself. We need to come to ourselves like the prodigal son all the time. What is the Christian life other than coming to yourself? What's the purpose? The purpose of the Christian life is to come to yourself and to know who God is, to know who you are, and to know who your brother is. That's life. That's what we do here. That's what business we're in, right? That's what it means to be Christians, to be small Christs, right? That's our calling. So once a week, try to work it in. Just spend 15, 20 minutes of solitude by yourself, without distractions. Leave your phone in the mailbox, something, right? Take your watch off that beeps now and all that stuff. This is another one that I think is really obvious, but really tough because the world has made it look like this. Divine liturgy. and I'm speaking to myself before anyone else, who among us have come to divine liturgy 5 minutes before it starts? To sit, thank you, Deb, to sit and to come into the reality of what the liturgy is about to offer us. Right? Liturgy comes and goes and comes and goes and comes and goes. And we say, I don't benefit from liturgy. When have we come and just 2 minutes before Abuna starts, sat and quieted ourselves and said, what is about to take place here? What am I about to be a part of? And if you don't know, that's a great way for you to go and read up on these things, right? But the point is that you're asking yourself the questions to get yourself moving in a direction that allow you to come to yourself later, right? When have we come to liturgy just a few minutes early and said, X, Y, and Z is what's about to happen here? This is mind-blowing. The next 2 hours, 3 hours are going to be heaven on earth. But I'm speaking for myself. The second I come to liturgy, I'm okay, the candle and the sharia and the screen and the abuna and so I'm speaking to myself first. But again, this is the mud world that we've created for ourselves. We brought mud even into our own unmudded world, right? Last thing is to have a designated place. I think there's something valuable in, like when we said, get up in the morning, the first thing you do is have a minute of solitude. I think there's a really big value in having a place in your home or having a regular thing that's different from the normal to allow you to feel that something is happening, to allow you to feel that something different is happening. So like you can have an icon corner in your home or one night's icon that you go and stand in front of. Or you can have like a certain room that you go to or a certain walk that you like to take. Or if you're a runner or a whatever, or a walker, right? Just do something different that'll make it feel like you're not just doing the same thing, but in a different way, right? And to end, yearly, take a spiritual health day. We talk about mental health days, right? And those still aren't really normal, right? I think they should be, but take a spiritual health day. I think from what I've seen, we take off of work for ridiculous reasons throughout the year, right? I need my teeth cleaned, or I need to go and get my whatever changed, or of course all that stuff needs to happen. But when have we taken half of a day off of work and invested in our spirituality, invested in our relationship with Christ, and had a day of solitude, where we've gone to a local monastery or local retreat center, right? This is what it means to retreat. I know we think of retreat as this big thing where we all come together and we all talk about this thing. Retreat is leaving, right? Retreat is solitude. I think a yearly retreat where you sit and on a big scale ask yourselves the same questions that you're asking yourself daily and weekly of who is God, who am I, where am I headed, what am I doing, and how am I serving my neighbor the way I'm supposed to be serving my neighbor. This is the place, solitude is the place where that stuff happens. Make a day out of it. Go visit some place, do something different. Encourage yourself to do this thing that we know now is valuable, right? Any questions? Please.
So is solitude different than prayer? And if so, how is it different?
Again, all of these things are going to be intertwined, right? Because solitude without prayer doesn't really work, right? Because prayer is our communication with the God that we're trying to meet in solitude. But prayer is going to be just words if there's no solitude, right, to begin with. Why? Because the Father seeks those who worship in spirit and truth, right? So if we're worshiping Him in just spirit, and we have a really nice relationship with Him, and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk, but there's no truth, we're not realigning ourselves, then what is our prayer exactly? It's just hearing ourselves talk, right? So it's connected with prayer, it's separate from prayer, they sort of interlace. Does that answer? Yeah. Any other questions? Michelle, sorry.
So you said it's solitude to ask yourself these questions. I'm just trying to figure out, you said, give yourself 20 minutes like this, quiet, and then do you ask yourself these questions
Yeah. Yeah. When we say those 15 to 20 minutes, take in the gospel, coming to yourself, right, with the prodigal son was a moment. Or it's presented to us as a moment where it's just one line, it's a few words. When in reality, this might have taken him days or weeks or months to come to this realization of who he is and what his state is and all of this. So solitude weekly is our time to take that process and do it intentionally, to sit down and say, what is my identity, right? Am I living in correspondence with my identity? Who is the God that is giving me my identity? Learning more about him, right? It's the time where we intentionally just start to think about these questions, I think. Yeah? Yeah, please. Here, everyone.
I think when the very act of stopping, and kind of retreating from the world, begins to say something by itself. Before we even begin to say any words in solitude, the very act that we...
For the recording.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I think the very act of stopping in solitude begins to say something before any words come out in solitude. Because when we look at solitude, and solitude is the retreat from the world in order to gain clarity, we live in a world that is in constant motion. Like when we go to our work or jobs or anything like that, it is constant motion. When we go to school, it is constant motion. It is about producing. When we stop and retreat into solitude, we're not in motion. We are not producing anything that this world would be able to measure, okay? And by just stopping those two, we begin to take on the mentality that you've heard in the church probably say, like, we're sojourners here. That we're here for a period of time, but we're not meant to be here, right? We travel through this world, and we are called to be members of society in this world, but to not fully plant ourselves and root ourselves. So in the very act of stopping, to not produce, to not be in motion, says something about our identity. And it reminds us that we are not what we produce. It reminds us that we are not meant to be in constant motion, and doing and doing and doing. And so it's a really good point. The practice of it almost speaks volumes by itself before you get into the nitty-gritty of what do you say. Like, I think what Peter was saying, the questions and reaffirming our identity, reaffirming, this relationship with God that I have is important in solitude. It allows us to do that. But the very act of stopping and separating speaks for itself about what we claim to be important. So with that, I think something that is helpful that we have passed around in this community before, and I sent it out. So this is a rule of life. It's a worksheet to help you with crafting a rule of life. And a rule of life, here's a rule of life. It's about looking at your life in 4 boxes. Okay, what is your prayer life? What is your rest? What is your work? And what are your relationships in life? Everything that you do will fall into one of these 4 boxes. Okay? And the worksheet, the 2 pages before, will guide you on how to fill it out. Okay, will guide you on how to fill it out and what to put in what boxes and so on. So as we progress through this series, this is a good tool to use and kind of have with you to see, okay, well, how can I incorporate solitude into my prayer life? How can I incorporate silence? Okay, how do I, work these things into my life in a more tangible and objective way, rather than, I really agree with everything he said, but I have no idea how to really work it in, and then we go and we get caught in the busyness of life. This is one of the ways that it's kind of like a life worksheet. It's a live document. As you change, it changes. So one of the things, I'll send it again in this week's email, but if you can dig up your old email, this is a tool that I personally use to look and organize my life and say, where's my time going? How much of my time is going into ministry and into the family and into rest, and how much time am I praying? And a lot of times, if you look at your life on paper, you'll see that paper speaks more than your intentions. Like, a lot of us intend to do a lot of spiritual things. But when we actually write it out, we'll see that the actual practices of life, if we're honest with ourselves and we fill it out, the actual spiritual practices that we have are probably lacking. I could probably guess that most people can fill a lot in this work box. Okay? If you're a student, that is your work. Okay? So the amount of time you spend in class and studying and groups and all these different things, it goes in that work box. Okay? Many of us will have very lopsided work boxes, very empty prayer boxes. When we talk about rest, many of us don't know what rest is. Okay? And relationships, we have a false sense of relationships because we are falsely connected through social media and different things. So challenging yourself to use this tool, okay, will help you as we progress through this series to think about how to incorporate the different things that we're talking about, different practices that we're talking about. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just to kind of explain how this book is working with this series. So we finished the first round of community groups last week, which was on fasting. I've heard a lot of good feedback from the different community groups. This week, it's going to be about solitude, and this book has 3 chapters, all right? Very nice and easy read, so easy that you could actually read it a couple times, over the course of these 6 weeks. And to be honest, I've gone through the book probably 2 or 3 times now in preparation. Every time I go through the chapter, new things pop up to me. So you're encouraged to read it. As you prepare to go to your community group this week, reading the chapter on solitude will help you prepare your mind as to what's going to be talked about, along with listening to this. All you were present, but people who will read it or weren't here will watch it. So you watch, you read, and then you go to community groups, and your community group discussions will be a lot more fruitful that way for you. So it's an easy read. So that's for solitude this week. Then next week will be silence, and we'll be speaking about that, and you can go ahead and read the chapter. If you read the chapter before you come to next Sunday on silence, next Sunday will make that much more sense. Because these are new topics. Not new topics, we've heard of them, but we're trying to address them in a deeper way. And so the more you're exposed to it, I guarantee that if you were to read the chapter, attend City Salt, then go to community groups, you'll address it, you'll attack the topic in 3 different ways, and you'll gain more out of it. And the understanding why this is important for you, starts to hit home more, and you're more likely to incorporate the practice. So any last questions on those? Okay, let's stand up and pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We thank you, Lord, for all your blessings, and we thank you, Lord, that you've called us out of this world. You've called us to stop. You've called us to retreat because you desire to show us something that is far more important than anything we would have in this world. And that is the truth about who we are and who you are, and the truth of your love for us, and the care that you'll provide for us. So many of us struggle with the anxiety of leaving a world of production, that when we leave that world of production, how would we provide? But Lord, when we leave in order to seek after you, you promise us that you will provide. Just as you provide for the birds of the air and the lilies in the field, so you will provide for us as we are made in your image and your likeness, and our identity comes from you. So Lord, help us to find comfort in knowing that when we go, when we stop producing, that you care for us, that you show us the truth of your love for us. So we ask, Lord, that you would continue to guide us week by week, that you would encourage all of us to join together as we head to the monastery for a retreat to you. Bless our week, keep us safe, and through the intercessions of all your saints, hear us as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as 'tis in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. in Christ Jesus our Lord. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Now the love of God the Father, the grace of his only begotten Son, our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, giving gifts of the Holy Spirit, be with you all. Go in peace. The Lord be with you.